Okay, hello everybody. I think we'll get started. It's a couple of minutes after noon here on East Coast time. So hello and welcome to the Housing Solutions Lab panel on advancing equity in local housing planning, learning from the past to promote a more equitable future. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So my name is Martha Galvez. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Solutions Lab here at NYU's Furman Center. The Housing Solution Lab was just recently launched in June of this year. We work with small and mid-sized cities, which we define as places with between 50,000 and 500,000 residents on affordable and equitable housing policy. So we do this through research and data analysis, through technical assistance directly with cities, by hosting peer learning opportunities for city leaders, and by disseminating what we're learning about housing policy work happening in small and mid-sized cities. We host the Local Housing Solutions website, which is a robust library of case studies and policy briefs and other information related to local housing policy. You can check us out at housingsolutionsLab.org if you haven't already, and please do join our mailing list. So I'll start us off today with just a bit of context on what motivated this panel discussion today, before moving on to our truly excellent group of panelists. So we're here today to learn more about how cities are examining and deconstructing their historic planning policies and decisions with a critical eye. We know that exclusionary and discriminatory housing policies have shaped America's cities and continue to drive present-day inequities in housing and in health and in access to opportunity. Zoning decisions, land use regulations, and development policies explicitly promoted racial segregation and limited wealth building opportunities for people of color. Acknowledging that past is a first step to a more equitable future. So across the country, some cities are working to understand and to document and to reckon with their own histories of discrimination and exclusion and the ways that those practices have shaped present-day racial and spatial inequalities. Undertaking this work helps reveal the starting points that cities can use to redress past harms and to build more equitable communities. It can also spur momentum to help generate popular support needed for reform. So this is really challenging work, and in many ways, it's really uncharted work. The 4 cities we'll hear about today, Minneapolis, Baton Rouge, Louisville, and Boulder, are all really at the forefront of it. And each city is coming at it from a different entry point and has unique insights to share. So our goal for this hour is to learn what we can from these cities' experience, specifically about how and why they went about this work, how they've built political support and popular support for their reform efforts, and where they see this work moving in the future. So with that, I'll introduce our panelist and moderator and just give a little bit of information about the work happening in their cities. Full bios for the panelists are available in chat and in the program that's been dropped in chat. I'll ask that each of our panelists now turn on your cameras and take yourself off mute as I read your names. And then I'll hand things over to Monique King-Veland to moderate. So some very quick housekeeping for the audience. Please remember you can drop questions you have for the panelists at any time into Zoom's Q&A function, and the panelists will be answering your questions at the end of the discussion. And also this event is being recorded. We'll have the video and panelist information and any links shared today available on our website after the event. So with that, we have, and I'll start with Andrea Brennan, who is the Director of Community Planning and Economic Development for the city of Minneapolis. Minneapolis is maybe best known for being the first city in the nation to eliminate single-family zoning and allow duplexes and triplexes citywide. So ahead of these reforms, the Mapping Prejudice Project made racist housing policies visible and tangible for the public by mapping racially exclusionary property contracts. It was the first effort of its kind in the nation. We also have Clay Thong, who is the manager of community relations and the Office of Human Rights for the City of Boulder's Department of Housing and Human Services. So Boulder is similarly undertaking a deep dive into the history of its founding and development over time, to raise awareness and educate the public about Boulder's history related to race and class, and to document how its history impacts the city's current housing disparities and challenges. We also have Emily Liu, the director of Louisville Metro Planning and Design Services. So Louisville recently launched a comprehensive interactive story map website called Confronting Racism in City Planning and Zoning, which explains the fundamentals of zoning and of land use regulations, and then goes deep into the specific policies and regulations that shaped the city starting in the early 1900s. And then we also have Christopher Tyson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Build Baton Rouge. So in Baton Rouge, the redevelopment authority under Christopher's leadership is really demonstrating ways that public development agencies, which were previously the mechanisms driving inequitable land use policies and disinvestment in Black and Brown neighborhoods, how these agencies are recentering and re-envisioning themselves as tools for community engagement, for equitable development, and for neighborhood revitalization. And then last but not least, we have Monique King-Wieland, who is Associate Vice President of Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy at the Urban Institute. Monique is also a member of our steering committee here at the lab, and she's also a former head of the LA County Redevelopment Authority. We are very grateful to have her experience and insights informing our work at the lab and today for this discussion. So with that, I will hand it off to Monique. Thank you all again so much for being here, and we're really excited for this conversation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Martha, for the kind introduction, and thanks to the Housing Solutions Lab and the Furman Center for the invitation to moderate. Welcome to the webinar participants, and I'm also very excited to welcome our panelists. Andrea, Clay, Emily, and Chris, thank you so much for joining us. We'd like to start by hearing from our panelists about the strategies that they've used to really examine the planning history of their cities, the legacy of structural racism, and the impact on their current work to address present-day housing challenges. Andrea, Minneapolis has been lauded in recent years for a major new zoning plan that included putting an end to single-family zoning, as Martha mentioned. Throughout the planning process, the city examined its legacy of discriminatory policies, such as racially restrictive covenants that led to racial segregation and wealth gaps that persist even today. Can you describe the process of examining this legacy and why it was so important for the city to do so as it thought about reimagining the city's zoning?
Yes, thank you, Monique. We embarked on updating our comprehensive plan back in 2017. We started that planning process with a community engagement strategy. So we knew going into this that we needed to really conduct robust community engagement. And part of that engagement strategy was making sure that we provided really good information and data to our community members as we engaged with them. So you mentioned the Mapping Prejudice project. That is a project that has mapped all of the racially restrictive covenants that are recorded against primarily single-family homes in Minneapolis. So we used those maps, we brought them out into our community engagement. We also used other data from the University of Minnesota Center for Urban and Regional Planning. They did this exercise where they looked at neighborhoods in Minneapolis and the affordability, how affordable they are to the average earning white, Black, Hispanic, and other racial ethnic groups. They showed how affordable these neighborhoods were to the average income earning household in those different racial and ethnic categories. And then we looked at that in 2010. And then, or I'm sorry, we looked at that in 2000, and then we looked at 2010, and then we looked at the most recent data, and you could see an absolute disappearance of affordability for certain racial and ethnic groups. So those were two really key pieces of data that we used in having these really robust communications. We knew that we led the nation in certain racial disparities when it comes to home ownership rates, when it comes to educational attainment, incarceration rates, et cetera. And we really wanted to put those racial inequities front and center in all of the discussions and all of the dialogue that we had with our community groups. So we use these data tools to do that. We did not set out to eliminate exclusive single-family zoning. That was not a planner, priority or goal going into this process. It really was something that came out of the community engagement that we did. In fact, one of the things that we did is when we showed these maps of the city and the affordability levels and the racially restrictive covenants, we asked people to put a little pin in like where they live, where they previously have lived, where they have a connection. And then we asked them to put Post-its like recommending what they want to see in their city. And there was a couple of Post-its that were put on these maps that said, eliminate single family zoning. And when we were digesting the input that we received through this engagement, we were looking at these Post-its thinking, well, we can't do that, can we? And I mean, sure enough, it turns out you can do that. So, we didn't set out that way. And I would say that it wasn't just in response to trying to address our racist housing policy in the city and in the country. It was also recognizing just this loss of affordability and diversity and choice. And what we heard very loud and clear from our community members all over the city is that folks want more housing opportunities. They want different kinds of opportunities. They want more diverse options and more affordability. And they want them in every neighborhood in the city. And when you have neighborhoods in like Minneapolis, for example, we have neighborhoods that are primarily single family homes. You can't get at that diversity and increase affordability without looking at the single family home zoning requirement and consider relaxing that. So a big part was, yes, addressing our racist past in land use policy, but also it was really to try to make a difference in expanding choice and opportunity in every neighborhood in our city.
Thank you, Andrea. It sounds like too, it was about sort of linking that past and the present in a way that allowed you to really rethink the next steps. Emily, I want to shift to you. The city of Louisville has also leveraged zoning reform as a tool to begin to dismantle the historic and current policies that have resulted in intense racial segregation. What steps did Louisville take to examine its history and its manifestations in current practice? And how did that influence your recommendations for changes to the city's zoning ordinances?
Well, I have to say, everybody probably heard about Louisville is undergoing this zoning reform, but we started actually 5 years ago. I want to echo what Andrew just said. We started actually with a comprehensive plan about 5 years ago, and we updated a comprehensive plan. One of the themes is equity. It's very important to the community. The equity is kind of a theme throughout the comprehensive plan. And also subsequently, we did advancing equity report as a result of the comprehensive plan and house need assessment. And only a couple years ago, we hired a consultant to diagnose our land development code, what is zoning for Louisville. So this did not just happen like overnight. So even though we launched the zoning reform the summer of 2020, all this work has to be done with a tremendous public engagement. I would like to go back a little bit about, give a little bit background about Louisville. I think a lot of people may not know where, well, Louisville is actually a consolidated government. And like Minneapolis is some other city with very urban, Louisville is a city and county like merged together. So we have urban area, we have suburban area, we also have rural area. So that's kind of different. And that's why our land area is huge. We have 400 square miles. That is about the 6 times the size of Washington, D.C. We have a population about 783 as of 2020. So as of today, Louisville is still a very segregated city with a huge family wealth gap between Black and white household. The home ownership rate, for example, of a Black family is less than half of that of a white family. And also depends on which part of town people live in. The average life expectancy could vary as much as 12 years. 12 years. How did all this happen? For over a century, many land use policies, practices, and regulations in Louisville, probably in other cities as well, have intentionally contributed to these inequalities. So when Louisville started its zoning reform during the summer of last year, we decided to start looking at its history. So planning staff created a story map called Confronting Racism in City Planning and Zoning. For those of you who are watching, I think there is a link dropped in the chat. I hope you have an opportunity to look at it closer. A lot of information. We're very lucky we have a lot of documents available in our office, where the planning office going back 100 years. So in archives, we got them together. We put them in a story map format. The reason we do that is this historic information is sometimes very hard to read. For you as a person of color or just like regular citizen, reading those documents that was drafted 100 years ago, it's very, very difficult. So we created this map, have some interactive functions. You can look at some pictures, you can look at some maps, and there are some links to other documents or even links to some audio recordings. So that's very important. This document, not just historic, but also some current policies, practice, regulation in Louisville. And Louisville is not unique. In many ways, you can see some of the same policies in other cities. Like Andrew was talking about, the deed restriction is definitely in Louisville as well. And there's history about that too. So back in 1914, Louisville is one of the few cities that passed a housing segregation ordinance. Basically says, you cannot, if you want to purchase or live in a block, if you're people of color, want to purchase or live on a block of mostly occupied white, you are not allowed to do that. It's prohibited, and vice versa. So this law was challenged in court in 1917 in the case Buchanan versus Worley. It's a very famous case. Louisville is famous for that case, actually. Although this landmark case deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, it applied only to legal statutes, not private agreement. So as a result, Andrew just said, racially restrictive covenant became very, very common since the 1920s, and it still exists today. Some of the not racial ordinance, but also like deed restriction, we look at even say last 5 years, it has language in there saying the minimum size of the house has to be 2,600 square feet. So that in a way exclude people of a different income level. So, and after that, everybody know the redlining, slum clearing, urban renewal, and also intentional disinvestment in community of color by cities, environmental injustice, all of that. It's just not one, it's layer after layer of restrictions for people of color to have an opportunity to move up or to move to a neighborhood which have opportunity for them. But also on top of that, what we're talking about today is the exclusionary zoning practice, creating single family or other low density district, disallowing more affordable housing types, including mixed middle housing, multifamily, even duplex or accessory dwelling unit. We find out it was totally prohibited in single family zoning. And in Louisville, it's probably not unique. We have 75% of the land area are zoned single family, and single family only. Up until 3 months ago, accessory dwelling unit is not even allowed in that.
Wow.
So all of that history really inform us, like we need, first of all, we need to acknowledge this history. It's very important that we acknowledge it, and then we kind of confronting that history so that we can move forward, rectify all these, these wrongs that history created for our community. So that's our starting point, and that's make us more intentional doing the work moving forward, including the process, public engagement, trying to reach out to the community of color and those who are marginalized throughout the history, and also make some recommendation. During the last year and a half, close to a year and a half, we have intensive public engagement, and the citizen, the first time we usually do public engagement, we talk about the history. So we talk about the history with citizens, we talk about history with our lawmakers, we talked about history among ourselves. So the planners are the first one to acknowledge this. That really help us moving forward.
Thank you so much, Emily. It sounds like there were definitely some synergies between the work that was happening in Louisville as well as the work that is happening in Minneapolis. I want to transition now over to Chris. Baton Rouge has also faced challenges, much like we've heard, around racial segregation and also sort of disinvestment because of historic policies like urban renewal. You lead a redevelopment authority. I've led a redevelopment authority as well. How does your work to revitalize communities in the present address the historic policies and practices that resulted, honestly, in some of the blight and the current neighborhood inequities today?
Great. Well, thank you, Monique, and everyone for putting on this panel, and the panelists for being here. It's an incredible discussion, and I'm thrilled to represent Baton Rouge as a part of it. As has been said, it's important that we are anchored in our particular local histories, right? And there's the national narrative that I think, fortunately, people are growing increasingly familiar with around all of the aspects of kind of urban marginalization, specific racialized, the racialized design of cities and how that continues to impact issues of wealth distribution, resources, poverty, how that's all mapped onto the city today. But we know, as we've heard about Louisville, and as we all know in our own particular context, that these histories are also very local. And it's important that we understand the shaping of identity and the shaping of the social meaning of place in our respective locales as we try to address and unearth the roots of the discrimination and the disparities that we see, and also address them. Where I begin is that none of what we see in the contemporary metropolis, whether it's Baton Rouge or Louisville or wherever, is pre-political or a natural phenomenon, right? These are the intentional results of specific policies made in a conscious effort to achieve certain goals. None of it is accidental. There is no urban crisis. Crisis implies that there is something that we didn't see coming or we shouldn't have expected, given the investments and decision making that preceded what we see today. So when we begin there, we understand the massive level of public resources, political will, and public policy that were organized around the racialized development of urban space in all of these localities, right? And so when we understand the scale and enormity of that over decades, right, much of the federal government's interventions into creating a national housing market, in the post-New Deal era, are all racialized, right? As a core component of the policy. And once those dynamics are alleviated through Supreme Court decisions or just the evolution of policy making, there's no reparative work that's being done. So the impact of that, as we should expect, continues, and it continues cumulatively intergenerationally, right? So gaps don't naturally close, they naturally widen, right? That's just the law of compound interest. So we should expect these issues to get worse over time, absent any kind of significant intervention. And so it's important to understand that the same level of intentionality, political will, and resource deployment that created the problem is required at a minimum if we are serious about overcoming that problem. So when I think about the role of public agencies, and Build Baton Rouge is the redevelopment authority and the land bank for East Baton Rouge City Parish. Like Louisville, we are also one of those rare consolidated city parish governments. And for those of you unfamiliar with Louisiana, our parishes, our counties are called parishes. So we are a consolidated government. Our agency has jurisdiction over the entirety of East Baton Rouge Parish, which includes the city of Baton Rouge. We are the capital city, a metropolitan area of about 850,000 persons, just an hour up the road from New Orleans. And so, we have a lot going on, but our city is one that is marked by intense racial and spatial stratification. That is tied to a particular history. Build Baton Rouge is the redevelopment authority and land bank, is a relatively young redevelopment authority and land bank. We're just over 10 years old. So when we look at the formal structures that were around in the mid-century, creating this type of these dynamics, we did not have a redevelopment authority per se driving that kind of work. Actually, Baton Rouge is really a tale of kind of second half of the 20th century growth. We're a relatively small city for much of the first half of the 20th century, too small even to qualify for a residential security map, right? When you go looking for the residential security maps in Louisiana, New Orleans is the only one. And by the way, that's the redlining map. That's the map that banks used to determine where lending was going to occur. Government-backed lending, I should specify. So Baton Rouge, comes into, its modern era without many of the, kind of governmental structures and tools that other cities that we would consider peer cities today had in the mix. But we had a considerable amount of racial strife. We have the distinction of being the place where the first organized bus boycott of the civil rights era took place. Dr. King and Rosa Parks visited Baton Rouge to take those lessons back to Alabama and start the history that we kind of recognize as the start of that era of that chapter of the civil rights movement. We also have the distinction of having one of the longest running school desegregation lawsuits in the country, filed in 1956, settled in 2003. Forced busing happened here in 1981, and it's at that point that we begin to see many of the racial patterns in our city start to take shape. A school system that went from 50-50 by 1980 to almost 90-10 with regards to Black and white representation. And so that kind of massive movement of spatial reorganization and the political and social meaning of space, and the kind of changes in public schooling and all of these things that kind of support community and how we kind of think of ourselves as a collective identity and our civic identity and responsibility begin to shift. You may have read that recently we have a breakaway movement in the city happening right now that is being litigated. So those issues of racial and spatial stratification are still very fresh for us. They're happening in real time, and they are still areas where not enough discussion is happening, but we're excited that our political leadership has embraced a vision for equitable development to deal with our kind of north-south divide in the city, and North Baton Rouge being one of the most impoverished and Blackest places in the state of Louisiana, South Baton Rouge being the highest concentration of wealth in the state of Louisiana. So we're dealing with that by embracing an equitable development lens for what redevelopment and land banking means. We're excited. So I'll pause there, and I know there's a lot more to talk about.
Thank you so much, Chris. I struggled not to say preach when you were talking about the need for intentionality, both in how we got here intentionally and what we need to do to move forward as well. We're running a little over on time, but I wanted to shift to Clay. While Minneapolis, Louisville, and Baton Rouge are dealing with the impact of their historic policies on present day racial segregation, Boulder is a little bit different in terms of its challenge, right? So through an examination of your city's planning history, your work has shown historic decisions that have resulted in a Boulder that is now overwhelmingly composed of white, wealthier residents. Can you talk about your process of examining the city's history of racial exclusion and how you've motivated the city to have very different conversations and difficult ones about the current demographics of Boulder?
Thank you. Yes. I think I'd like to start, just give a few quick points about sort of Boulder's makeup. So we have about 108,000 people living in Boulder, according to the 2020 census, and we're spread out over 27 square miles. And there's a lot of sort of natural constraints. I think we're getting pretty close to full residential build out. There's a few pockets of light industry, since this is Boulder, kombucha factories and the like, places to get your climbing shoes repaired. I think that says something about Boulder. And, I suspect a lot of those neighborhoods are not going to be long for this world as we see more housing go in. I would say that last week's election kind of encapsulated where Boulder is really struggling with its identity. We had two slates of city council candidates. One is the more traditional slow growth slate that has really dominated municipal politics for the last few decades. The second was a more progressive slate, and the progressive slate, which is really more concerned with issues of affordable housing, providing more services to our neighbors that are experiencing homelessness, won a majority in the latest council election. However, there was also a ballot referendum to repeal a municipal ordinance that limits occupancy in residential housing to no more than 3 unrelated people. So that failed to pass, although the leading proponent of that was elected to council. So I think that gives a little bit of a light on kind of the identity struggles that Boulder is experiencing today. With respect to examining the city's history, what I found, or at least the conclusion I made very quickly, is that Boulder has two narratives. One is a very pleasant sounding narrative, as I like to call it, of myth. The other is the reality. And the myth has been that of, this is a great Western town, manifest destiny. And, we are somewhat constrained in our development because we literally have the foothills of the Rocky Mountains form the western border of town. We're ringed by open space that has been accumulated since the 1950s, primarily old agricultural land. And, our legacy begins with the breaking of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, where we essentially drove off indigenous peoples in the pre-Civil War era. And it became very quickly apparent that Boulder was not going to be like other towns. We did not encourage industry that we had in other neighboring towns, such as that related to agriculture and to mining. And there was a Boulder Land Company that was founded. And this is pre-Civil War, and they're charging $1,000 for a lot in Boulder, pre-Civil War. So I think that kind of set a tone that we're still dealing with today. The other really sort of horrific part of Boulder's legacy is Boulder was kind of a bit of ground zero for what became the Sand Creek Massacre, which was essentially the killing of, the most conservative estimate is of 150 indigenous peoples that had been removed from the area. And most of the military and political leaders involved in that were from the Boulder area. And about 2 miles from where I'm sitting right now is an old farm where there was an outpost called Fort Chambers, which was actually the fort where the Boulder military presence trained at for that. So, we're contending with that legacy, but I think, the next step is that we see that the development of the university, which is our largest employer and really shapes what the city is all about, one of the key players in that was a participant in the massacre and was a legislator and also had been sheriff, but took a leave of absence to join the army to, participate in Sand Creek. But the really frightening thing, and I think this sort of tells you about identity, particularly in the American West, he had a dorm named after him until 1989 at the university. And that dorm was later renamed Cheyenne Arapaho Hall. So that's kind of the first phase of Boulder. We didn't necessarily have to have a lot of restrictive laws. We didn't need to because stuff was expensive. It's not accessible. In 1910, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. writes a report about, Boulder, and, many of you are familiar with his work, and it's all the sort of typical city beautiful, very pleasant kind of stuff. And that, I think, had been accepted as, okay, this is the blueprint for Boulder from, the last century or so, without people realizing some of the racist underpinnings of the work that he was doing. So, Boulder has emphasized open space, a lot of growth restrictions. We have something called the blue line, which is an elevation above that we will not provide water, so you cannot build about it. We have always had historic opposition to policies that promote high density and affordable housing, under the guise that we want to have a lot of open space, urban parklands, et cetera. And now I think, and in my historic sort of examination, we're having a reckoning with a lot of the decisions that have been made in the post-World War II era. I think informed by Olmsted and, with this notion, Boulder prides itself on its embrace of environmental ethics, that a lot of these environmental, seemingly benign ordinances and regulations have really had an exclusionary impact. And that's really the challenge of what we're dealing with now. When the city sent its draft racial equity plan to city council in this past year, there was a portion that said, yeah, we need to look at these environmental pieces. And that was the piece that was met with the most resistance. So really, that's kind of the battle right now. And I think, getting to the second part of the question, I'll be quick. The difficult conversation, I don't think I'm the person who's motivated it. I think there's been a confluence of different things. We have leadership in our Housing and Human Services that sees this is the right thing to do, which is why we're doing that Housing Equity Symposium tomorrow. But also, I think we're seeing, with all the reckonings that have happened with, say, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and while all those things are a little bit more arm's length because we're so homogenous in Boulder, there is an awareness, and we are having, more progressive leadership come on board. And I think, with sort of reckonings within the environmental community where, okay, it's not just about resource protection, we need to look at environmental justice. I think that has primed the pump for the conversation that we're having now, but I think there's still a long ways to go.
Thank you, Clay. It's interesting because, Minneapolis, Louisville, Baton Rouge, Boulder, very different places in many ways, but I'm hearing also a lot of common themes across this discussion about understanding how history is impacting present day. And the need to understand that as you develop policies and strategies to move forward. I'm going to also just take a moment to encourage the webinar participants. We are going to have a Q&A at the end, so please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. We would love to be able to answer them. I want to shift gears just a little bit. We talked about the importance of understanding how a city has been shaped by its history and its legacy of structural racism in order to be and motivate more intentionality. I like Chris used that word. I think that's a good word. So more intentional, equity-focused policies in the present day. I want to build on that to talk more about how we ensure that policy responses benefit the actual communities who have been historically experienced, honestly, the most harm and continue to suffer the deepest trauma and inequities. Chris, maybe we'll start with you because you talked a little bit about this, thinking specifically about historically disinvested communities that have experienced a lack of public investment in infrastructure, services, and resources. What tools can cities use to bolster investments for the residents that live there today? And how do we ensure that any new investments don't lead to the same displacement or fail the same people that haven't already been left out and experienced the most harm?
I think you begin with policy. If we want to ensure that markets allow for everyone to remain in neighborhoods, then we have to regulate those markets with effective affordable housing policy. And that's just a basic thing that I know is very controversial in cities, including mine. But we have to begin there. right? Particularly in places that are gentrifying, where we have, a lot of demand for land and low supply. So we have to make sure that we are using policy to incentivize the development of affordable housing and protect existing housing to remain affordable. I think that's number one. Number two, we have to be focused on increasing the capacity of the community to help direct the destiny of their neighborhoods, right? Oftentimes planning and development are things that happen to communities, not with communities, and certainly not with those communities at the lead. In order for that to happen, we have to understand that if I can have a vocation and a career doing this work, I should not expect that people at the neighborhood level have to volunteer to do this work, particularly where they are already burdened by low wages, by a higher burden of all types of issues in those communities. So we have to find ways to professionalize the organizing work and the community development work that happens in neighborhood organizations. We have in Baton Rouge, organizations at the neighborhood level that are all volunteers. It's very hard to get resources, and it's very hard to have staff and people to do this work. And we kind of expect that it's just volunteer work, and we devalue it accordingly. So I think that's number two. And when you do have planning efforts, number three, I would say spend money in the community. Spend money on local businesses. If the planners are going to fly in and do all of this, your restaurants, your people who do photography and who do events in the community, your kind of mom and pop businesses, employ them. Don't just come ask them for their input. Don't just ask them to the charrette. Employ them. And make sure that you are redistributing resources as you are doing the work of community planning and community building. I think that's where we have true equity, and I would start with those three things.
Thank you, Chris. Andrea, what about in Minneapolis? How is Minneapolis working to ensure that its zoning reforms are benefiting communities, so BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous people of color, that have been the most impacted by past planning decisions, segregation, and disinvestment?
Great. Well, I just could not agree more strongly with all of the comments that Chris made earlier. We are where we are based on by design. I mean, we are in this place because this is exactly how where we were designed to get to based on the investments and the policies that have been in place historically. So acknowledging that and bringing the same amount of resources and intentionality to reversing all of that is absolutely critical. So in Minneapolis, we are focused on really both policy and investment, really bringing policy and investment to specifically targeted to addressing these disparities that we see. And I'll give you some examples. Similar to Louisville, like Emily mentioned, it's not just the zoning changes didn't just expand opportunity for duplexes, triplexes. There's also more missing middle type housing that's available or possible now based on the zoning changes. And we brought significant increase in investment in supporting developers who are building in that missing middle, duplex, triplex, and missing middle space. And we didn't just bring resources to support these developers, we also created career pathways to help developers, emerging developers from communities where they are operating, emerging BIPOC developers to benefit from not just, we didn't think about this just as who is the end, beneficiary of these investment, meaning who's going to buy the house, the affordable home, and live in it. It's who are we paying? Who are we investing in? Whose entrepreneurship are we supporting? Whose capacity as a community development organization are we supporting? And we, through our investments in, we have what's called a development technical assistance program, where we help emerging developers understand how the system works. And then we have a whole series of sort of pathways where we can help folks get more up to speed on how to develop in our city. And we've increased. Over half of the developers that we work with are Black, Indigenous, people of color led developers. So, I think taking that comprehensive view of making sure that you are supporting the community organizations that, number one, that have the trusted relationships with community members, and that really need to be there for the health and vitality of the community for the long term, that are vested in making the investments in preventing displacement from these communities when, as we grow and develop as a city. So those investments, and not just investments, but very, very targeted investments that are done through key community partnerships is one approach. On the policy side, policies that help support that. For example, the city adopted a community preference policy. So when we do develop affordable homeownership opportunities, for example, a certain percentage of those sort of the priority for selling those homes is for folks who either were displaced from certain neighborhoods during the foreclosure crisis or have been displaced since then. So that's an example of, again, very targeted, trying to target the benefits of the investments. Bunch of other policies that we've adopted. We've created cultural districts to make sure that we're, again, targeting investments in key cultural corridors to ensure that folks that have made our city a great place continue to get to live here. Inclusionary zoning. But I would just pause with just emphasizing the importance of zoning alone does not do it. Zoning alone is not a fix. It's necessary, but not sufficient without policy and investments that are very, very targeted in achieving our goals.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I think the point you ended with is really important for the audience, right? Like it's not just zoning. I think you touched on it, Chris touched on it as well. It's about intentional investments, resources. And, one of the things that we did not get to, because I want to be able to shift to the questions from the audience as well, but it also takes political will. And accountability on the other end is something key. And maybe that'll come up in our questions from the audience, but we do have a host of questions from the audience. So I want to be able to transition to that. One of the first questions, which isn't directed towards anyone in particular, so any of you can feel free to jump in, is, are there any strategies to combat state level laws that actually limit progressive policy at the local level? So potentially state level laws that impact your ability to make some zoning changes or other changes at the local level. And how do you all go about addressing or combating those type of laws at the state level? And anyone can feel free to jump in, just come off mute.
Louisiana has recently faced a fight at the state level over inclusionary zoning laws, and that was behind some efforts in the New Orleans region to advance inclusionary zoning. So New Orleans has made some strides there, but there has been a threat. Our governor vetoed that, but I don't think we've heard the last of that. Another issue that we have here in Louisiana is the issue of title clearance, which ties to our property laws, and we've been a number of issues to deal with the concentrated blight and the inability to clear title in neighborhoods that have severe concentrations of blighted and in many cases adjudicated property. So that's a state level policy issue that actually has a broad coalition of supporters and detractors. So it's a difficult issue to deal with, but it's one that we continue to push at the state level.
Anyone else have a thought about that question? How any strategies that you're using to address potentially conflicting, if you will, state level policies and laws? Okay. There's another question in the chat, and Andrea, I think this is actually directed towards you. It says, did Minneapolis perform any kind of retrospective evaluation of the outreach efforts? So did the city evaluate which forms of outreach were most effective at getting to historically marginalized communities involved, and was any of it ineffective?
We have not done a retrospective analysis of the engagement. Other than, I mean, we did it in real time. So we asked, we did collect input as we went along about the different engagement strategies. And we had many, many different strategies that we used, including, hosting meetings, so like just going where people were. And so we learned a lot from that. And what our major takeaway was that there is no one size fits all. I mean, you just have to make sure that you are, have a broad enough strategy that you truly are trying to, capture as many people as you possibly can, because it's not everyone likes to be engaged in exactly the same way. I will use this opportunity to say, though, that we entered into a partnership with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis to identify indicators over the next 10 years and measure against them to see if we actually are being effective in expanding affordability choice and reducing racial disparities in housing as a result of not just the land use policies, but the other policies and investments that the city's making. And I do think that accountability and really measuring effectiveness is important.
Forgot that I was on mute. Andrea, did I hear you say something about community-based organizations, like engaging local community-based partners when you were talking earlier about your outreach strategy?
Yes, and that's both an outreach strategy as well as, I think to Chris's point earlier, I mean, we provide financial support to a lot of community-based organizations because they do incredibly critical work. Our community-based organizations do a lot of work around helping folks get prepared for homeownership over a very long period of time, for example. And before we started really investing in those organizations, our results in, for example, the homeownership investments we were making in down payment assistance and other financial investments in homeownership, we were about 40% of the households we were serving were people of color. After really strengthening and expanding our partnership and relationships with community-based organizations, that has increased to about 70%. So again, it's working with the organizations that have that are community-based and that have are trusted partners to community members, and also, recognizing that we have a lot to learn as city government, and there has to be this two-way communication around what is working, what isn't working, how we can improve. And that really has to come from both engagement and strong community partners.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left, and one of the questions in the chat is also around sort of the question and the thought I posed earlier about political will. And the question from the participant is, can these benefits of the various strategies that we're discussing be moved forward without the backing or collaboration of municipal planning or community development departments? Is it possible to move through the nonprofit or financial institutions like a CDFI, and is that worthwhile? And I think sort of inherent in that discussion, right, is like, are these processes and things that need to be backed by the city or the public sector entity or the quasi-governmental entity, or are there other groups in the community that can be leading some of these efforts? And I would just love to hear your thoughts on that, any of you who would like to contribute.
Yes and yes. I mean, you have to, at the end of the day, political leadership is essential. Your government, your municipal government, local government has to be committed to this. This is long cycle work. It exists beyond political cycles, right? You deal with elected officials, and I want this to happen tomorrow. And it's like, just some of these things can't happen immediately, but we need to make investments and long-term investments. So they have to outlast political cycles, but also you need the full ecosystem. You need your CDFIs at the table. You need your philanthropy at the table. You need your nonprofits, your community level organizations, your larger banks who have, CRA responsibilities that could be channeled to support some of these efforts. Your state entities, how you're using HUD dollars. And so all of that is important in the community development ecosystem. And all of it has to be coordinated and in place.
This
Thanks,
is
Chris.
Emily.
Go ahead,
I
Emily.
totally agree with Chris. I think the political will is very important. We're talking about zoning. Zoning is law. So law has to be passed by lawmakers. And that's why it's important to engage them as well. In Louisville, we have 26 Metro Council members, and we don't expect them to all agree with us, but we do have a few champions, and that's very important. We also have a lot of outside organization, the affordable housing advocacy group, even ARP step up. We also have support from Urban Institute, who supported us in doing research, and that's very important, data and research. And those are when you present the facts, and that's very important too. We have lots of citizens involved in this. I would say the champions at your city hall, city council in Louisville is Metro Council, very important. I'll give you an example how important it is. So back in 2019, Louisville brought Congress for New Urbanism, CU 27, have a conference here in Louisville. And we intensely urged our lawmaker to attend them. And one of the keynote speakers is Donald Su. He talked about parking, all of that. And two of the Metro Council lawmaker were in that session. It's a little embarrassing because he was criticizing the parking regulation of Louisville. Guess what? A few months later, I was thrilled to receive a resolution from Metro Council with those two sponsors saying, hey, planning department, go ahead and review your parking regulation. And that's a result. We eliminate parking requirement for residential in all of the urban area and significantly reduce the parking requirement in the suburban area. So your lawmakers are very important. They are your partners, they are your champions. They could go the other way too, but I think it's very important to work with them as well as everything else. For this zoning reform, they actually passed a resolution. Metro Council passed a resolution supporting this and requesting planning and design to do this. It's very important to work with everybody.
Thank you so much, Emily. Really quickly, go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, just really quickly, because in Minneapolis, we had incredibly strong support from our mayor and our city council for all of this and more. But I want to point out too, advocacy is really important. Community advocacy played a huge role in Minneapolis and in getting these reforms passed. So a lot of grassroots organizing, a lot of community organizing, and that advocacy was absolutely critical.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrea. I think what we're saying is political will, it's political with a big P, which means more than just your politicians, but also your community members. I want to thank Chris, Andrea, Emily, and Clay very, very much for your time. I want to thank all the participants as well. And I'm going to transition it back to Martha for closing.
Thank you all so much. This is a really great discussion. We just started to get into it and scratch the surface. So I hope we can return together someday and see what happens next. So thank you, Monique, Emily, Clay, Chris, Andrea, for your time and for your insights today. And thank you to everyone who joined and asked questions. We didn't get to all of them. Emily, you were hitting all the right notes at the end, saying, data and research, which is something we, of course, really value at the lab, and I know in all of your organizations. So we actually have a tool that you can look at on our website to look at housing characteristics and disparities in the city you live in and in home ownership gaps, Black-white home ownership gaps. So I encourage you to look at those. And also know that Clay will be presenting his work tomorrow in a community meeting open to the public at Boulder. So we will get that link out to folks as well. And last thanks is to the Housing Solutions Lab team and the Furman Center team who helped pull this all together, and to our funder at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their support of the lab's work. And a recording of this will be on our website soon. So thank you again so much. We are exactly at time, which is great. And we are so appreciative, and we'll be in touch soon and are looking forward to tracking your work. Have a great day, everybody.